There's a new biography of Mary Queen of Scots out. We're talking about the Elizabethan period here a little bit in our break, and I was just mentioning we're having some conversation about the movie Elizabeth and some of its historical accuracies or inaccuracies. And one of the students was making the observation that the treatment of Mary Queen of Scots is just totally off historically. I mean, it may make good drama, but it was totally off historically. And I was suggesting that there's a new biography of Mary Queen of Scots, if anybody's interested, which has just come out. It has gotten really, really splendid reviews. So if any of you are interested in the period or interested in Mary Queen of Scots, there you go. You'll have a wonderful summer reading book. So, okay, well, we're going to move on now with Alexander Pope. And in our last segment, we were talking about the rape of the lock and the kind of satire that is involved in that. And today we're going to be moving to another work, Pope's Essay on Man, which is not satirical. He certainly exercises a good deal of wit in this work, but it's not satirical, and it's not intended to be funny in the same way that the rape of the lock is. So this is what we sometimes refer to as a philosophical poem. A philosophical poem in the sense that he is taking up here in a popular form. This is not intended to be an original philosophical work. What he's doing is he is writing a popular work for a popular audience based on what he would claim, and this is a direct quotation from one of his works, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. And Pope thought that that's what neoclassical poetry at its best frequently did. Now, this doesn't mean that you couldn't be original in certain ways, but often what you were conveying were ideas that had been around, perhaps among the ancients had been around. But what you were doing was giving a lively and original expression to certain ideas, and therefore conveying them anew to a new audience. And here, of course, he's going to be dealing, as Milton did, with the problem of evil. And once again, you will recall that we spent a great deal of time talking about this in connection with Milton's Paradise Lost, but in the 18th century, this all was beginning to take a somewhat different form, as we shall see. The special form that this problem, this philosophical and theological problem, the problem of evil, was taking in the age of reason or enlightenment, was that there were those skeptical rationalists who were using reason, using philosophical reason, rational analysis, to discredit divine justice. To say that it is impossible for a reasonable person to believe in a traditional Judeo-Christian conception of God. And Pope, being a child of the age of reason, of course, himself, uses reason in this poem to show that reason, what reason can and cannot do in the realm of theology or religious thought. There are some things that reason can discover and can explain and can defend, according to Pope and many of his contemporaries, but there are also things in religious belief which are beyond the reach of reason alone. And that also is an issue that we've talked about here before, you know, in connection with the emergence of early modern science, that there were some who took very skeptical view of religion and religious faith as a result of their adherence to a certain form of early modern science, which was heavily empiricist, and they felt that the only valid forms of knowledge were those which could be empirically verified, or conversely, there would be rules for empirically falsifying certain kinds of claims or propositions. So, in other words, along with the advent of early modern science and its enormous successes and its enormous cultural prestige, there were some, at least, who took some of the findings and some of the ideology, if you will, of modern science to promote a kind of religious skepticism. And that's precisely the sort of thing that Pope is going to attempt to counter here. And we talked about a little bit of the background for this also when we were talking about Milton, and I mentioned that if you go back to even in the later Middle Ages, there were philosophical theologians like William of Ockham, some of the Franciscans, certainly the mystics of the later Middle Ages. The later Middle Ages, by the way, is the great golden age of mysticism, at least in Christian tradition, who said that religious truth is simply something else. It simply is beyond the reach of reason and of scientific examination. But it is nonetheless true. It's simply another kind of knowledge and another kind of truth, which we have access to in different ways than through the methodologies that we employ in science and philosophy. And Martin Luther, for example, even went so far at one point to call reason the whore of Babylon. The whore of Babylon. And what he meant was not that one should not use reason. What he meant was that one should not, from his point of view, misuse reason in the area of religion. And so he made a very sharp distinction, following some of the medieval thinkers whom I was mentioning a moment ago, between faith and reason. That there were things that were known to faith and there were things that were known to reason, but those did not necessarily coincide with one another. And we've also talked about that in connection with Milton and with the developments in early modern science already. Here we have yet another development of this discussion in Alexander Pope, and it's taking a specifically 18th century turn of mind. And this is an era, if we can go back to the PowerPoint, please, that we associate with deism. Deism. You've probably at least heard the word deism in connection with the study of early American history and early American culture in some of your American history or maybe American literature courses. And one of the most famous deist works of the 18th century was by a man named Paley, who wrote a work called Natural Theology. Natural theology, that is to say, a theology which is based on the study of the natural order of the universe. And notice some of the tenets that are presented here by the deists. What the deists were trying to do, because after all, I keep saying this, I know, but it's important to keep this in mind. This is what was claimed to be the age of reason. And so there were many people who said, well, then we have to have a religious belief. If we're going to have a religious belief, we have to have a religious belief which is based on reason and on basic rational principles. And deism was an effort to try to do this. Now, was everybody moving in this direction? Absolutely not. There, of course, were many people who were very traditional Roman Catholics, many people who were traditional Protestants, many people who were traditional Jews, simply to take the major Western religions, and were quite unaffected in many cases by deism as a movement. On the other hand, many intellectuals were very much attracted to deism. And we know that people like, over here, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson all claimed to be deists. So, and of course there were many people in Europe who also claimed to be deists as well. So first of all, this natural theology is based on the premise that there is a universal order. In other words, there is an order to the universe in all of its various dimensions, both on the large scale and on the microscopic scale, that everywhere we look, we find evidence of order. And this, the deists as well as other intellectuals of the 18th century claimed, is what primarily had been demonstrated by Newton. You know, in Newton's own time, Newton was regarded not only as a wonderful mathematician and scientist, but he was also regarded as a theologian, and as a theologian who had made an advance of the very first order in the study of theology. How? Because, once again, what Newton seemed to have done for the 18th century was to have established the rules according to which the universe operates. And that was thought to consist of the rules by which God not only created the universe, but also governed the universe. In other words, God became, in effect, a kind of grand engineer. A kind of grand engineer who designed this incredible machine, the universe, which ran according to very orderly principles, and finally somebody had made the breakthrough to understand what the fundamental rules were of the operation of the machine. And that, of course, they claimed was Newton. And the argument, of course, from natural theology, advanced by Paley and others. I simply mention Paley because Paley was one of the most popular writers of the period, and his book was immensely influential, particularly on popular thinking. According to the perspective of natural theology taken by a deist, universal order necessarily implies a divine orderer. In other words, if we look at all levels of scale, if we look at the universe as a cosmos, as an order, and we see that everything is behaving according to perfectly orderly principles, which can actually be measured mathematically, then we see order throughout the cosmos. If we look down even to the microscopic level, as people increasingly were doing with the advances in optics in the 17th and 18th centuries, which were building on the advances of optics that had been made by that time for about 300 years or so, the advances in optics were becoming such that they could actually begin to do microscopic studies as well. And what did they find there? Well, when they looked not only through the telescopes, but when they also looked through the microscopes, they were finding everywhere evidence of order. Maybe a different kind of order than they expected, but order nevertheless. Remember the story of Galileo? What he discovered was different from what he expected, but it was a confirmation of order nonetheless. So, universal order, according to the argument here of natural theology, necessarily implies a divine orderer. I mean, how could you have such an incredibly intricate machine operating as the universe does at all levels of scale without there being a supremely, even divine intelligence who has done the ordering of the system in the first place? And so Paley, in a very famous analogy, uses the argument of the watch and the watchmaker. And what that means is, he says, what if there were a watch lying on the sidewalk, and you're walking on the sidewalk, and you pick up this object, and let's just say that you've never seen a watch before, and you don't know what a watch is. And you sit down with it, and you listen to it, and it's ticking, because we're not talking about our digital watches that most of us nowadays have, but we're talking about conventional watches that run with springs. So we listen to its ticking, and its ticking is very regular. And if we watch long enough, we can actually see that the large hand is moving, and it's moving in a very definite direction and with a very definite speed. And if we watch long enough, we will notice that the small hand, the hour hand, has also moved in a definite direction with a definite speed in relation to that of the larger hand. And then let's say that we get even more curious and we decide to open up the watch. And so you pry off the back and you look into the watch, and what do you see? You see all these little gears and the springs and whatnot, all working in perfect harmony in relation to one another to produce the movement, which is the watch, which is the measurement of nothing less than time. Well, according to Paley, would it not occur to you pretty quickly that there must be some intelligent being, and very highly intelligent being, who has designed and made that watch in the first place? And of course, he's going to argue, well, yes, obviously, you would come to that conclusion. This could not simply have come about through some kind of random chance. How much more so, then, would it be true that when we investigate the universe and find an even more intricate mechanism, an infinitely more intricate mechanism, that we would have to conclude that that had been designed and made by a divine intelligence. This is natural theology, okay? Natural in the sense that it's theology in a sense, right? Because it's coming to the conclusion that there is a divine being, and even coming to certain conclusions about what that divine being must be like. The divine being, first of all, would have to be supremely intelligent, would have to understand all kinds of principles, would have to understand what the point of making the universe was, and so on and so on, so that there were certain limited inferences one could make, according to the deists, based on an investigation of nature itself. And that's why it's called natural theology. Okay, so then Pope's argument, now I'm just going to generalize, and then we're going to go and look at the particulars in a moment. Pope's argument is going to be that we know the cosmos as a whole is governed by a system of order. How do we know that? Well, we know that because Newton and the other scientists had already been not only exploring, but demonstrating that that was true. And so when we point to evil, as we could, right? Some tragedy occurs, could be natural evil, something like a fire, terrible fire, or a flood, or tornado hitting us, or something or other like earthquake. Or it could be an instance of moral evil, the kind of evil that people do to one another. So we can point to things like that. And we can say, well, this is evidence of disorder. Things just don't work the way they ought to. But what Pope is going to argue is that when we point to evil as evidence of disorder, we are seeing only the part and not the whole. In other words, that even things which may appear to us to be evil or mistakes on God's part, assuming that there is a God, would not be seen as such if we could see the entire scheme, the entire cosmic scheme of things. So, human reason has great power, and that had been manifested in the incredible advances that science and other kinds of analytical activities were having in the 18th century. But reason should not, as we shall see in one of his lines, presume God to scan. How can human reason encompass God? And he goes on to argue that universal order, and he believes that we have evidence of universal order, that is to say, order everywhere in the universe, necessarily implies universal good, which is an interesting logical jump for him. Okay? That order necessarily implies the good. Thus, whatever is right is going to be his conclusion. Whatever is right. In other words, whatever God has created must be right. Must be right. Okay? And so, what we should do then is understand our true place on the great chain of being. Remember in Milton, the great sin of Satan, first of all, of course the other devils too, but they were mainly followers of Satan. But the great sin of Satan was that he wanted to rise above his proper place on the great chain of being. That high as he was, that wasn't enough. He wanted to be God. He wanted to be the equal of God or even the superior of God. So he wanted to raise himself on the great chain of being, and that was his great mistake or great sin. So also with human beings. If human beings presume God to scan, if human beings want to become, as he puts it, as we shall see in a moment, the God of God, then human beings likewise have committed the sin of pride, trying to raise themselves above their proper station in the great chain of being. So that leads to an acceptance of our limitations as human beings, as well as our strengths, our powers for knowing the truth. There's only so much we can do, great though reason may be. So, okay. Well, let's look at the work itself. I mean, first of all, any questions about what I've just said? Yeah. Oh, did you want to go back to that? We can go to the last one. Okay, let's see here. You're welcome. Okay. That we all have our place on the great chain of being, and remember that God is up at the top, then come the angels, and of course there are different orders or degrees of angels, according to the study of angelology, as it was called, and then human beings come next, and then below humans are animals, below animals, vegetation, and below that, ultimately we'd find inorganic matter, and then below that would be chaos or unformed matter. Unformed matter. It's interesting, by the way, that one of the theories in contemporary physics nowadays is that there's a lot of stuff out there in the universe which is unformed, or at least as yet unformed. And that's what the Greeks called chaos. Okay, and so what Pope wants us to do then is to recognize both our strengths, to be sure, but also our limitations. So, okay. Well, let's go back to the work itself now. Awake, my St. John. That would have been pronounced St. John, by the way, by Pope and his contemporaries. Leave all meaner things. That's, by the way, a friend of his. Leave all meaner things. Leave all lower activities, especially lower studies. To low ambition and the pride of kings. You see, the philosopher, according to Plato, is really superior to the king. Plato even went so far as to say that our philosophers ought to be our kings. I mean, if in a reasonably ordered world, we would make our philosophers our kings. Okay? So, leave all meaner things to low ambition and the pride of kings. Let us, since life can little more supply than just to look about us and to die, expatiate free o'er all this scene of man, a mighty maze. You see, let's look over all of nature, including, of course, human nature. You know, nature is not just something out there, right? I mean, that's what we often mean when we talk about nature, but nature is right here too, right? A mighty maze, but not without a plan. See where he's going to get to the notion of order, design, reason. A wild, where weeds and flowers promiscuous shoot. Okay? You know, we look around in nature and what do we see? We see things just sort of shooting up all over the place, don't we? Promiscuously. Promiscuously. I mean, the word promiscuous, I know that we tend to use that with, in connection with sexual connotations in our time. But the word promiscuous simply means unregulated. Unregulated. Something that just, you know, pops up all over the place. Okay? A wild, where weeds and flowers promiscuous shoot, or garden tempting with forbidden fruit, of course, with a nod not only towards the biblical story, but also towards Milton. Pope was an avid reader of Milton, by the way, and often in his works, as I mentioned with The Rape of the Lock, you will find echoes of things that you find in Paradise Lost and elsewhere in Milton's poetry. Together let us beat this ample field, try what the open, what the covert yield. Try in the sense of try out, experiment with, make trial of. Things that are open, but also things that are covert, things that are secret. The latent tracts, the giddy heights explore, of all who blindly creep or sightless soar. I, nature's walks, shoot folly as it flies, and catch the manners living as they rise. Laugh where we must, be candid where we can, but, and notice, this is right out of Milton, isn't it? Vindicate the ways of God to man. Remember the beginning of Milton's Paradise Lost? He said that that's what his great argument was all about. But Milton was writing for a different kind of audience. Milton was writing for people whom he assumed were Christian believers. Pope is writing for people who may or may not be Christian believers. Okay, so he has a different audience in mind here. Say first, of God above or man below, what can we reason but from what we know? Okay? We are always going to be limited in our reasoning to what we know, what we actually observe, what we actually experience. Of man, what see we but his station here, from which to reason or to which refer? Through worlds unnumbered, though the God be known, 'tis ours to trace him only in our own. What do you suppose that's a reference to? Through worlds unnumbered, though the God be known? Anybody have any ideas? You may think that this is a very modern notion, but Pope and his contemporaries had already begun to speculate about the possibility that there were other worlds in the universe with intelligent beings like ourselves. Why not? They were just beginning to realize how absolutely immense the universe is. And they still didn't know the true immensity of the universe. But, in such an incredible universe as this, are we the only place in this immensity where some kind of life exists? Or in which some kind of intelligent life exists? It's entirely likely that there are other places. And that's not just science fiction. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That the same kinds of conditions that promoted the growth of life on our planet could exist somewhere else in this huge, huge, huge universe. Okay, and how do we even know that this is the only universe? We more or less have marked out what scientists think are the limits of the universe, but who knows if that's even the only universe? Well, okay, so through worlds unnumbered, though the God be known, 'tis ours to trace him only in our own. We can only begin with the experience that we have and the knowledge that we have. He who through vast immensity can pierce, see worlds on worlds compose one universe. Observe how system into system runs, what other planets circle other suns. See, they were beginning to become aware of that. Earlier on, because of the physical limitations of technology, people could only make observations of our sun and the planets that circle our sun and so forth. But now they were beginning to realize that beyond our solar system, there were many other solar systems. Okay? And notice that only God could observe all of these intricate systems and their interactions with one another in some vast cosmic system. What other planets circle other suns? What varied being peoples every star? I mean, there could be all kinds of different beings, not just, beings who look like us. So, may tell why heaven has made us as we are. But of this frame, the bearings and the ties, the strong connections, nice dependencies, gradations just, has thy pervading soul looked through? Or can a part contain the whole? Can a part contain the whole? It's an interesting problem, isn't it? I mean, it's not unlike the problem of cloning, where at least theoretically what you could do is you could take any cell out of a being, some organic being, and you could grow a whole new being out of that one cell. Okay, well, whether that's true or not, theoretically, at any rate, it seems possible. Is the great chain that draws all to agree and drawn supports upheld by God or thee? Notice the great chain, this is the great chain of being. The idea of which, as I've said in earlier classes, goes back into the ancient classical world, but continues on down through late antiquity, through the Middle Ages, on through the Renaissance or early modern period, and now here in Alexander Pope. Presumptuous man. Presumptuous man. And that, of course, is going to be part of his argument. Presumptuous man. The reason wouldst thou find why formed so weak, so little, and so blind? Do you really think that with all of the weaknesses and limitations of human beings that you're going to solve the puzzle of the universe? And really understand God and the mind of God? Now remember what I said last time. Pope is also, he's not only a believing Christian, I mean specifically he's a Roman Catholic, but he was also a child of the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. So yes, he is a believing Christian, but at the same time he also wants religion to be reasonable to the extent to which it can be reasonable. First, if thou canst the harder reason guess, why formed no weaker, blinder, and no less? Ask of thy mother earth, why oaks are made taller or stronger than the weeds they shade. Or ask of yonder argent fields above, why Jove's satellites are less than Jove. Of systems possible, see what he's saying is, you know, you don't have any idea of even what kinds of questions you're asking. Of systems possible, remember, part of the argument about the problem of evil is that an all-powerful God could have created any kind of universe, right? So there are other possible universes. Why then did God choose to create this universe in which we find suffering and evil? Okay, so here is Pope taking that argument on. Of systems possible, if 'tis confessed, if you are willing to concede that wisdom infinite, God's wisdom, must form the best of all possible worlds. Okay? If you are willing to concede that there is such a thing as infinite wisdom, and that infinite wisdom would choose the best of all possible worlds, where all must fall or not coherent be, and all that rises rise in due degree, then in the scale of reasoning life 'tis plain, there must be somewhere such a rank as man. Okay? Interesting argument, by the way. And an argument which goes back to ancient times in certain ways. And all the question, wrangle ere so long, is only this: if God has placed him wrong, him being man, and this is not man in the sense of male only, of course, this is male and female, but in the older sense where we used to use man for male and female together. Respecting man, whatever wrong we call, must be right as relative to all, as relative to the whole scheme of things. See, the argument that he's developing is we don't see the whole scheme of things. So on what logical grounds do we have warrant to say that any particular part of that scheme is wrong? In human works, though labored on with pain, 1,000 movements scarce one purpose gain. In God's works, one single movement can its end produce, yet serves to second to, in the sense of also, some other use. In other words, God can do something which also accomplishes more than one objectives at the same time. So man, who here seems principle alone, perhaps acts second to some sphere unknown. I mean, we look around us and we see human beings are the principal beings on our planet, at least according to our understanding of things. But perhaps we act second to some unknown sphere, touches some wheel or verges to some goal. 'Tis but a part we see and not the whole, which of course is what he has been preparing for all along here. When the proud steed shall know why man restrains his fiery course, or ox drives him o'er the plains. See, does the horse really understand why the human rider is driving him over the fields? Does the ox really understand why the human farmer is using him the way he does to draw the plow? When the dull ox, why now he breaks the clod, is now a victim, and now Egypt's god. Sometimes he's a beast of burden, and sometimes he's treated as a god in some religions. Then shall man's pride and dullness comprehend his actions, passions, beings, use, and end. So also we. You see, just as the ox doesn't understand the purposes for which he is used, so also do we not understand the purposes for which we have been created and are used by God, is his argument. Then shall man's pride and dullness comprehend his actions, passions, beings, use, and end. Okay? Why doing, suffering, checked, impelled, and why this hour a slave, the next a deity. Then, see, here's the inference or conclusion that he's going to draw out of all of this. Notice that this is a carefully constructed deductive argument. Deductive argument. He lays down his premises, attempts to establish those premises as plausible, and then he draws his conclusions from them. Then, in the sense of therefore, say not man's imperfect, heaven in fault. Say rather, man's as perfect as he ought to be on the scale of being. His knowledge measured to his state and place, his time a moment, and his point, and a point is space. If to be perfect in a certain sphere, what matter sooner or late, or here or there, the blessed today is as completely so as who began 1,000 years ago. Well, okay. So let's proceed with the argument. And once again, let me just say that Pope's argument is not, as I've been indicating along the way, entirely original. He's drawing upon certain kinds of arguments that had been around for a long time, some of which had been revived in his own time. But what he's doing in this poem, he is giving us what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. What oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. And that's the function of his philosophical poem, to give us something that we'll sit down with, reflect on, but this is not pretending to be professional philosophy as such. Heaven from all creatures hides the book of fate. See, we don't know what the future holds. All but the page prescribed their present state. From brutes from men what spirits know, or who could suffer being here below, and so forth. And then jump down here to 91. Hope humbly then, with trembling pinions soar. Wait the great teacher death, and God adore. The great teacher death? Why would death be a great teacher? Because then you would know, right? Yeah, then you might know. I mean, if you're a religious believer and believe that after this life, you're going to go on to another life in which all these things are going to be clear to you, then death becomes a great teacher, in a sense. Wait the great teacher, death, and God adore. What future bliss he gives not thee to know, but gives that hope to be thy blessing now. And then notice the next line. How many times have you heard this next line? Hope springs eternal in the human breast. Okay, hope springs eternal in the human breast. You know, there are some people who like to count things in various areas, right? I mean, there are people who love to be statisticians and whatnot. There are people who have actually attempted to do counts on who are the most quoted writers or what are the most quoted works in English literature, or at least literature in England. And of course, no big surprise, the Bible is going to come out number 1. Number 2 is Shakespeare. I remember one time some years ago, I was teaching, I believe it was Hamlet. Anyway, it was one of Shakespeare's plays. Maybe it was Lear, but I think it was Hamlet. And I had a student who said, wow, this play is really something. It's got all those quotations in it, which of course is exactly the other way around, you know. According to the people who have done the statistical studies, Pope is number 3. It's amazing when you're reading Pope how many phrases and even whole lines have just entered into our common vocabulary, such as this. Hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but always to be blessed. To be blessed. The soul uneasy and confined from home rests and expatiates in a life to come. Lo, the poor Indian. Lo, the poor Indian. Remember, we saw this in Milton, the reference to Columbus. I mean, people were aware of the New World. I mean, they didn't know everything about it, obviously, yet, but they were aware of the explorations in the New World, and certainly by Pope's time, the exploration of the New World had been going on for well over 200 years. I'm talking about by Westerners now, by Westerners. And already the idea had begun to develop of what a little bit later on in the 18th century, the French philosopher and writer Rousseau is going to call the noble savage. That is to say, we may think of ourselves as very sophisticated and very advanced, as the pinnacle of civilization and of advancement. But wait a minute, it's altogether possible that there are these people out there in the world, the ones whom we call noble savages. By the way, the word savage in French doesn't have the same negative connotations that it does in English. The French word sauvage means something more like primitive, which also doesn't carry the negative connotations the word primitive does in English. What it really means is, certainly in Rousseau, people who live closer to nature than we do. People who live closer to nature than we do. I mean, think of how we live. We live our lives in controlled environments to a large extent, especially in a climate like that in Houston, Texas, where it can be, you know, unforgivably hot in many months of the year. And so we retreat as quickly as possible to air-conditioned environments, don't we? And in the wintertime, while winters are not particularly bitter in our part of the world, we likewise attempt to live in, as much as we can, in controlled environments to keep the pains of cold away. And the same kind of thing is true in other ways in which we control our environments, not simply in our dwelling places or our working places, but in our forms of transportation, our forms of work, the foods we eat, the drinks that we drink, and so on and so on and so on. How close to nature are those things? Well, of course, during the so-called Enlightenment or Age of Reason, there was a tendency for people to think in terms of civilization through reason, science and technology, but through reason more generally, advancing to higher and higher and higher and higher states of being. That we were actually improving as human beings. Well, the counter to that is, well, how great are we? For all of our advances and our sophistications, have we really morally advanced, individually and collectively? And if we have, where's the evidence of that? With our vaunted rationality, what we have done is we have created even greater and greater and greater ways to destroy more and more parts of our planet, and to harm more and more people, and to kill more and more people. So, are these the fruits of reason? I mean, it's a very ambiguous kind of result, isn't it? So, in any event, that kind of philosophical or cultural optimism also had its counters. Something that we talk about in the second half of this course is how World War I, more than any other single event, shattered that kind of philosophical optimism in the West, at least for many younger and well-educated people. And of course, the whole 20th century from that point on continued to be our great teacher in that respect. Okay, let's hope that the 21st century works out a little better than the 20th. But in any event, see, this is one of the counter-arguments. What about people who live closer to nature? You see, are they really lesser beings than we are? Maybe they have a better life than we do in certain respects. Remember Milton's argument about that also. Adam and Eve before the fall, living in a state of nature. There's also a sense of a state of innocence, too. So lo, the poor Indian whose untutored mind sees God in clouds, or hears him in the wind, his soul proud science never taught to stray. For as the solar walk or Milky Way, yet simple nature to his hope has given, behind the cloud-topped hill a humbler heaven, some safer world in depth of woods embraced, some happier island in the watery waste, where slaves once more their native land behold, nor fiends torment, no Christians thirst for gold. Aha, no Christians thirst for gold in places like Mexico and Peru and elsewhere. To be contents his natural desire. He asks no angel's wing, no seraph's fire, but thinks admitted to that equal sky, his faithful dog shall bear him company. In other words, what about this person whom we look down on as the poor Indian? Here he's talking about American Indians, of course. Are they really less than us? Or maybe they know something far nobler than we do. Well, let's continue this after a short break.